Before we take a look at what everyday life was like for a gladiator, we should take a look at what life was like in ancient Rome to get an understanding to what reasons someone would decide to become a gladiator. Life in ancient Rome was highly stratified, with a rigid hierarchy that determined an individual's status, rights, and privileges. The social structure was divided into two main classes, patricians and plebeians. Patricians were the upper class, made up of wealthy and influential families who held positions of power in the government and society. Plebeians, on the other hand, were the lower class, consisting of commoners, artisans, and farmers. This video is brought to you by Bullet Clash. Bullet Clash is a free multiplayer mobile game. You can play against other players, including friends, family, or bots if you prefer to play single-player mode. You can download the game for free today from Google Play Store or Apple App Store. Download Bullet Clash today. Patricians enjoyed many privileges that were denied to plebeians. They had access to the best education, were allowed to hold political office, and had exclusive rights to own property and conduct business. They also had more freedom to pursue leisure activities, such as attending the theater, gladiator games, and other forms of entertainment. Plebeians, on the other hand, were largely excluded from political power and were limited in their ability to accumulate wealth and property. They were required to pay taxes, serve in the military, and were subject to harsh penalties for even minor offenses. However, over time, plebeians began to gain more rights and representation in government, and the social and economic gap between the two classes began to narrow. In addition to the patrician-plebeian divide, there were also other forms of hierarchy and social distinctions in ancient Rome, such as gender, ethnicity, and slavery. Women had limited rights and opportunities compared to men, while slaves were considered property and had no legal rights at all. Ethnic minorities were also discriminated against and often faced social and economic barriers. The available work opportunities varied depending on a person's social status, gender, and skill set. Here are some of the most common types of work in ancient Rome. 1. Agriculture. Farming was the most common occupation in ancient Rome, and the majority of the population worked as farmers or laborers. Many people owned small farms, while others worked as tenant farmers or slaves on larger estates. 2. Crafts and trade. Artisans and craftsmen were responsible for producing a wide range of goods, including pottery, textiles, jewelry, and furniture. Many of these artisans worked independently or as part of a guild, while others were employed by wealthy patrons. 3. Commerce. Trade was an important part of the Roman economy, and merchants played a key role in importing and exporting goods across the empire. Many of these merchants were part of large trading networks and were based in major port cities such as Rome, Alexandria, and Carthage. 4. Military service. Military service was mandatory for all male citizens who met certain age and property requirements. Soldiers were paid a salary and provided with food and equipment, and many went on to have successful careers in the military. 5. Public service. The Roman state employed a large number of officials and bureaucrats to manage its affairs, including tax collectors, magistrates, and judges. These positions were generally reserved for wealthy citizens or members of the patrician class. 6. Entertainment. Actors, musicians, and performers were an important part of Roman society, and many made a living by entertaining audiences in theaters and amphitheaters. The Colosseum, also known as the Flavian Amphitheater, was built in Rome between 70 to 80 AD during the reign of the Flavian emperors, Vespasian and his son Titus. It was commissioned by Vespasian as a gift to the Roman people and was built on the site of Nero's Domus Aurea, a palace that had been destroyed by fire. The Colosseum was designed by a team of architects and engineers, led by the Roman architect, Rabirius. The construction of the Colosseum was a massive undertaking, and it required the labor of tens of thousands of slaves and skilled workers. The Colosseum was built from stone and concrete and could seat up to 50,000 spectators. It was used for a variety of events, including gladiatorial games, mock sea battles, and animal hunts. The Colosseum remained in use for over 400 years until it fell into disuse and was eventually abandoned. Today, it is one of the most iconic and recognizable symbols of ancient Rome and is a popular tourist attraction. The Colosseum, also known as the Flavian Amphitheater, was used for a variety of events throughout its history. Here are some of the most common uses of the Colosseum. The Colosseum is perhaps best known for its role in hosting gladiatorial games, which were popular spectacles in ancient Rome. These games involved trained fighters, often slaves or prisoners of war, who battled each other or wild animals in the arena. The gladiatorial games were highly ritualized and were seen as a way of reinforcing social hierarchies and promoting virtues such as bravery and endurance. 2. Animal hunts. The Colosseum was also used for animal hunts, known as venations. These events involved trained animals, such as lions and bears, that were pitted against each other or against human fighters. Animal hunts were often held as part of larger spectacles, such as the gladiatorial games. 3. Mock sea battles. The Colosseum was capable of being flooded, and it was occasionally used for mock sea battles, known as naumachii. These events involved large-scale naval battles that were reenacted in the arena, often with elaborate stage sets and special effects. 4. Public spectacles. The Colosseum was also used for a variety of other public spectacles, such as processions, theatrical performances, and public executions. These events were often held to mark important holidays or religious festivals and were attended by large crowds of people. It is worth noting that the events held in the Colosseum were often highly ritualized and symbolic, and they played an important role in reinforcing social hierarchies and promoting the values of Roman society. While some of these events may seem cruel or barbaric by modern standards, they were an integral part of the cultural and social fabric of ancient Rome. Gladiators were typically owned by private individuals or organizations, who were known as lanisti. These lanisti would purchase, train, and manage groups of gladiators, whom they would then send to compete in the games held at venues such as the Colosseum. In ancient Rome, the lanisti were private entrepreneurs who owned and managed gladiatorial schools, known as ludi. These ludi were essentially training centers for gladiators, where they would learn combat techniques, develop physical strength and endurance, and prepare for battles in the arena. Lanisti would typically acquire their gladiators from a variety of sources, including prisoners of war, slaves, and criminals who had been sentenced to death. They would then train their gladiators in specialized schools, where they would learn the skills needed to fight in specific styles, such as Mirmillo, a heavily armed gladiator, Thraex, a lightly armed gladiator, or Retiarius, a net-wielding gladiator. The life of a gladiator was often brutal and short, with a high risk of injury or death in the arena. However, successful gladiators could earn significant amounts of money and fame, and their owners could profit greatly from their victories. Lanisti would often invest heavily in their gladiators, providing them with food, lodging, and medical care, as well as sponsoring lavish public spectacles to showcase their skills. Despite the potentially lucrative nature of their business, lanisti were often viewed with suspicion and even disdain by Roman society. The gladiatorial games were seen as a corrupting influence on public morals, and the idea of profiting from the bloodshed and suffering of others was seen as morally questionable. Nevertheless, the lanisti continued to thrive throughout the Roman period, and their influence on the development of the gladiatorial games cannot be overstated. Lanisti were often wealthy and influential individuals, and owning gladiators was seen as a symbol of status and power. They would invest significant amounts of money in acquiring and training gladiators, hoping to make a profit from their victories in the arena. Some lanisti even became celebrities in their own right, with their names becoming synonymous with their successful gladiators. Gladiators themselves were typically slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals who had been sentenced to fight in the arena as a form of punishment. However, some free men also chose to become gladiators either for financial gain or because they saw it as a way to achieve fame and glory. Regardless of their status, gladiators were considered property and had no say in their own fate, with their lives and deaths being determined by their owners and the whims of the crowds. Life as a gladiator was difficult and dangerous. Gladiators were professional fighters who were trained to entertain audiences by engaging in combat with other gladiators, wild animals, or condemned criminals. Here are some key features of what life was like for a gladiator. 1. Training. Gladiators underwent rigorous physical training to prepare for combat. They were trained in various fighting techniques and weapons, and were expected to be in top physical condition. 2. Living conditions. Gladiators typically lived in barracks or training schools, and their living conditions were often cramped and uncomfortable. They were fed a special diet designed to build muscle and increase stamina. 3. Health risks. Gladiatorial combat was a dangerous profession, and gladiators faced a high risk of injury or death in the arena. They were often wounded in combat, and many died as a result of their injuries. 4. Social status. Gladiators were often seen as low-status individuals, and were looked down upon by higher classes in society. However, some gladiators achieved great fame and fortune through their skills in the arena, and were celebrated as heroes by the public. 5. Treatment. Gladiators were usually treated as commodities by their owners, who invested a lot of money in their training and equipment. However, some owners did show concern for their gladiators' well-being, and would pay for medical treatment or even retire them if they were injured. 6. Death. Death was a common occurrence in gladiatorial combat, and many gladiators met their end in the arena. However, some gladiators were able to survive and even thrive in the profession, earning the respect and admiration of their fellow gladiators and the public. Diet. The diet of gladiators in ancient Rome was focused on providing them with the strength and stamina needed to endure the physical demands of combat in the arena. Gladiators were typically fed a diet high in carbohydrates and protein to provide them with energy and build and repair muscle. Some of the common foods included in a gladiator's diet were: 1. Barley. Barley was a common staple in the gladiator's diet, as it was a good source of carbohydrates and protein. 2. Beans. Beans were another common source of protein and carbohydrates for gladiators. 3. Lentils. Lentils were a good source of fiber, protein, and carbohydrates, and were often included in the gladiator's diet. 4. Grains. Grains such as wheat and oats were also included in the gladiator's diet to provide energy and carbohydrates. 5. Meat. Gladiators were often given meat, such as beef or chicken, as a source of protein and to help build and repair muscle. 6. Vegetables. Vegetables such as kale, cabbage, and turnips were also included in the gladiator's diet to provide vitamins and minerals. In addition to their regular diet, gladiators were also given a special drink called posca, which was made by mixing vinegar with water. Posca was believed to help quench thirst, replenish electrolytes, and provide a boost of energy during combat. Overall, the diet of gladiators in ancient Rome was designed to provide them with the nutrients and energy they needed to endure the physical demands of combat in the arena. As mentioned earlier, there were many reasons people became gladiators. Let's look at the common reasons. Slaves. Slaves in ancient Rome could be either gladiators or victims of gladiators, depending on their circumstances. Some slaves were trained as gladiators and fought in the arena as a profession. These gladiators were usually purchased by gladiator schools, which trained them in various forms of combat and provided them with food, shelter, and medical care. While the life of a gladiator was dangerous and often short, it offered the potential for fame, fortune, and even freedom if they won enough fights and earned the favor of their patrons. On the other hand, Many slaves were forced to fight in the arena against their will. These slaves were often criminals, prisoners of war, or people who had been condemned to death. They were typically given little or no training and were forced to fight against trained gladiators or wild animals in front of large crowds. For these individuals, fighting in the arena was a brutal and often deadly experience. It's worth noting that not all gladiators were slaves, and not all slaves were gladiators. While some gladiators were indeed slaves, others were free men who had chosen to enter the profession for various reasons. Similarly, while many slaves were forced to fight in the arena, others were used for other forms of labor, such as agriculture, mining, or domestic work. However, it's worth noting that criminals were sometimes executed in the arena as a form of public punishment. These executions could take the form of wild animal hunts or staged battles between criminals or prisoners and trained gladiators. While the criminals in these battles may have been given weapons or some minimal training, they were not considered to be gladiators in the same sense as those who had trained and volunteered for the profession. In general, the use of criminals in gladiatorial combat was rare and was not a significant part of the gladiatorial tradition in ancient Rome. Most gladiators were trained professionals who were highly skilled in combat and were given substantial training and equipment. The use of criminals as gladiators or as victims in gladiatorial combat was seen as a form of public entertainment and punishment, rather than as a legitimate form of gladiatorial combat. Prisoners of war played an important role in the gladiatorial fights in ancient Rome. Many prisoners of war were sold into slavery, and some of them were trained as gladiators to fight in the arena. The use of prisoners of war as gladiators was particularly common during the early years of the Roman Republic, when the state did not have a large supply of slaves for use as gladiators. As the Roman Empire grew and expanded, however, the demand for gladiators increased, and many more slaves were brought in from conquered territories to fight in the arena. In general, prisoners of war who were trained as gladiators were treated much like other gladiators. They were given intensive training in combat and were equipped with a range of weapons and armor. They were also given food, shelter, and medical care, although the conditions of their training and living quarters were often quite harsh. If a gladiator won many fights, they might be given a wooden sword called a rudis by their owner, which symbolized their freedom. This meant that they were no longer slaves and could leave the arena if they chose to do so. Many successful gladiators chose to continue fighting, however, because they enjoyed the profession and because it was a lucrative way to earn a living. In addition to earning their freedom, successful gladiators could also earn a great deal of respect and admiration from the Roman people. They were seen as brave and skilled fighters, and many people were fascinated by the spectacle of the gladiatorial games. Overall, while the life of a gladiator was often brutal and difficult, it was possible for a successful gladiator to gain social status, respect, and even freedom through their skill and bravery in the arena. Prisoners of war played an important role in the gladiatorial fights in ancient Rome, both as a source of new gladiators and as skilled combatants who were admired for their bravery and fighting prowess. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Be sure to hit that notification bell if you want more videos like this.